Hi guys, now it's time to finish the reading. This is the last video to be watching. Now it's pretty obvious what our goals are going to be, but I will go over them. We're going to develop a more nuanced understanding of Socrates' previous arguments that were raised in Section 7 summary, the Section 7 summary video, okay? So our first success criteria is we're going to draw upon our prior knowledge, which we got from that summary. Then we're going to trace the development of arguments related to how one should live a good life. But this time we're tracing them, so we're looking for what we call nuances, which is refinements and extra detail, extra depth. We're going to trace arguments related to how communities should enable people to live good lives. So I guess, again, we're going to trace again the arguments related to how communities should enable people to live good lives. And we're going to trace the development of arguments that are related to how people should live a good life. Okay? Can you quickly score yourself on those? And I want you to draw me the three qualities that Socrates argued were very important. That is, that in order, one must have to be a paradigm of virtue, or it's probably better to say paradigm of goodness. One should have the capacity to be just, one should have the capacity to be religious, and one should have the capacity to be brave. So can you draw those three things as an APK for me, please? All right, let's get the party started. We're just going to read the summary and then we're going to go through to the end of the text, okay? So a lot of this should be familiar. Faced with defeat, Callicles resorts once more to sullen abuse, and Socrates continues the argument alone. The good life and human happiness depend crucially, he argues, on self-discipline. In fact, the whole universe can only function well as an orderly whole. The arguments he has been putting forward and his cosmic perspective provide the justification for the revolutionary view which provoked Callicles' entry into the discussion that doing wrong is worse than suffering it. So that's where we finish. Let's start. Callicles. I don't know what you're going on about, Socrates. You better find someone else to answer your questions. Oh, sorry. Same person, sorry. Callicles. I don't know what you're going on about, Socrates. You better find someone else to go and answer your questions. Socrates. Old friend, he can't stand people doing him good. Sorry, our friend here can't stand people doing him good. In fact, he can't stand what we've been talking about, being disciplined. So here it makes perfect sense. Socrates literally believes that the discussion he's having isn't rhetoric. It's a good discussion about philosophy. It's engaging in philosophy because it's looking at truth and knowledge, but the actual aim of truth and knowledge in that discussion is to do good for Callicles and for himself. So it has to be an area of expertise, not a knack. Okay? Actually, these arguments of yours don't interest me in the slightest, and I've only been answering your questions for Gorgias' sake. Socrates. Well, what shall we do then? Are we going to break off mid-discussion? That's up to you. People say it's wrong to leave even stories unfinished, though. A story needs a head on it, they say, otherwise it goes around headless. So please help our discussion get ahead by answering the rest of my questions. Sorry, that was not... I did that Callicles voice, but that was Socrates that just said that. Okay? Callicles then replies, you're a bully, Socrates. But didn't you say, Callicles, I find that funny because you just said that to the strong and the clever should go the lion's share, and here you are accusing Socrates of being a bully. My advice to you would be to forget about the discussion, or at least find someone else you can talk to. Any volunteers? No. Well, then let's not leave the argument unfinished, Callicles. Couldn't you complete the argument by yourself? Couldn't you just talk to yourself and answer your own questions? Socrates. Then I'd really have to be, as Epicharmus puts it, capable of saying all alone what it took two men to say before. But by the looks of it, though, I don't have any choice in the matter. All right, let's do it that way. Once knowledge of what is and isn't true in these matters is out in the open, we'll all benefit equally. So I think we should all try to be the first to get there. I'll tell you how to think the argument go. I'll tell you how I think the argument goes on. Then, but it's up to you to challenge me and show me where I am wrong, or where I'm going wrong. If any of you get the impression that I'm failing to recognize mistakes in my own thinking. The point is, you see, that I certainly don't speak as an expert with knowledge. I look into things with your help. And this means that if someone disputes something I've been saying and seems to me to be making a good point, I'm the first to admit it. But there's no point in me saying all this unless you think we ought to finish the argument. If you don't want to carry on, let's leave it there and we'll go home. So here's kind of an appeal to the Socratic method. I make a statement, you question it. Let's fix up the exceptions. It's kind of like he's alluding to his Socratic method in this paragraph. Okay, Gorgias. Well, at any rate, don't think we ought to go home yet. Well, I at any rate don't think we ought to go home yet, Socrates. I'd like you to complete your argument, and I get the impression everyone else wants you to as well. In fact, for my part, I'd like to hear you round the argument off by yourself. Socrates. My own personal preference, though, Gorgias, would have been for our friend Callicles to have gone on talking to me until I'd repaid him for Xithus' speech with Amphimion's. I have no idea what's being talked about there. Anyway, even if you're not prepared to help me finish our discussion, Callicles, you must at least take me up on anything you hear from me which strikes you as incorrect. And if you do prove me wrong, I won't get cross with you as you did with me. No, I'll make sure the public register lists you as the greatest benefactor. Callicles. Just get the discussion over with, Socrates. Socrates. Here goes then. I'll review the whole argument so far. And here we start the monologue. Let's go. Is the pleasant the same as the good? No, they are different. Callicles and I agreed on that. Should the good be the reason we do pleasant things, or the pleasant be the reason we do good things? The good should be the reason that we do pleasant things, full stop. That should all just make sense to you guys because we studied that before. Isn't the quality of being pleasant which makes us enjoy things, and the quality of being good which makes us good? Yes. So you can't, if you're experiencing pleasant things, remember the coward, that doesn't necessarily make you good. Now, what does it take to be a good human being? What does it take to be good at anything? In fact, it always takes a specific state of goodness, doesn't it? And here's where he's talking about that idea of order. Let's see if we can read some more. I don't see how we can deny that, Callicles. And whether we're talking about a good artifact, a good body, a good mind for that matter, or a good creature, what it takes for these states of goodness to occur in an ideal form. So we know that ideal forms are being referred to through the whole thing because he talks to about betterness and improvement. And whenever you talk about betterness and improvement throughout a whole dialogue, in this case, you're actually talking about moving closer to the ideal form. All right. And he basically says one of the statements of goodness to occur in any ideal form is not chaos, but organization and perfection, and the particular branch of expertise whose province the object is in question, or the object in question is, right? I agree. So here he's saying that if the object in question is being studied, you want to help it get better, get closer to the ideal form. And getting closer to the ideal form is a form of good, right? That is what good is. Good is any practice that allows the object in question to move towards the ideal, all right? And that's why you would say medicine is a practice, a good practice, it's an expertise because it allows you to move towards the ideal healthy body. Whereas cookery, it doesn't allow that. It's just got pleasure in its own, in its own concern, all right? Right, I agree. In every case, then, a good state is an organized and orderly state, isn't it? I'd say so. So a thing has to be informed by a particular orderly structure, the structure appropriate to it to be good, doesn't it? I think so. So you can imagine that, yep. An ideal form of stairs has to be highly organized in order to produce that, and a tradesman does so. Well, the same can be said for a mind. Doesn't it follow that a mind possesses of its proper structure, that the mind possessed of its proper structure is better than a disordered mind? It's bound to be. But a mind possessed of orderly structure is an orderly mind, isn't it? Naturally. And an orderly mind is self-disciplined mind. Absolutely. From which it follows that a self-disciplined mind is a good mind. Now, I can't see anything wrong with this argument, Callicles, but if you can, please tell me what it is. All right. So he's just kind of proved it. It's probably time to take a note. No, an orderly mind is a good mind, which is a reference to the ideal forms because as we move closer to perfection, as anything moves closer to the ideal form, which is a good thing, then that process is about becoming more organized and less chaotic. So again, the mind needs to evolve towards this structure, which means it needs to reject any kind of disorder. And the way that you do that is through self-discipline. Take some notes. Callicles, just get on with it, Socrates. All right. If a self-disciplined mind is good, then a mind in the opposite state is bad. In other words, an undisciplined and self-indulgent mind is bad. Now, a disciplined person must act in an appropriate manner towards both gods and his fellow human beings, because inappropriate behavior indicates a lack of self-discipline. So here is just making, this is one thing that occurs a lot in Socrates' arguments that kind of annoys me. It's just this assumption based on social norms, which is kind of dressed up as logic. But he clearly says, though, that inappropriate behavior is a lack of self-discipline, and it isn't appropriate to behave badly with other human beings and the gods. So yes, that's bound to be so. Take a note about behaving inappropriately equals, etc. Well, when appropriate is used of the way we relate to our fellow human beings, it means just. So in other words, to be appropriate equals just. Take a note. More importantly, your note should have said being appropriate towards human beings. It means being just, not just appropriate. And when it's applied to the way that we relate to the gods, it means religious. So now you know why we have to be just and religious, because being just and religious are appropriate behaviors with reference to two different things. Just means to humans, religious means to the gods. Okay? Take a note. Again, here we see what we call nuance. This wasn't mentioned in the summary that I provided at all, but we can see how he's extrapolating or looking at deductions from the term appropriate and then applying it to what it means with behavior in front of human beings. And then he's performing some more deductive logic when we look at religious, and he's applying that religious as a form of appropriate behavior with relation to gods. This was never ever mentioned in the summary, but we see how the logic is unfolding, okay? And of course, anyone who acts justly and religiously is a just and religious person. True. He's also bound to have courage, because a disciplined person doesn't choose inappropriate objects to seek out or avoid. No, he turns towards or away from events, people, pleasures, and irritations. And when he should and steadily endures what he should endure, it follows, Callicles, that because a self-disciplined person is just, brave, and religious, as we've explained, he's a paradigm of goodness. Right, so here at the top, he's basically said that in order, you have to be brave to face those good experiences. That can also be quite disturbing, all right? Because a disciplined person doesn't choose inappropriate objects to seek out or avoid. In other words, he doesn't look at inappropriate objects and then run away from them. But if he comes across them, he faces them, all right? And if you can do all these things, then you're a paradigm of goodness. Paradigm of goodness. Follows Callicles' paradigm. Now, a good person is bound to do whatever he does well and successfully. And success brings fulfillment and happiness, whereas a bad man does badly and is therefore unhappy. Unhappiness, then, is the lot of someone who is the opposite of self-disciplined. In other words, the kind of self-indulgent person you were championing. That's my position, and I believe it to be true. If it really is true, it looks as though anyone who wants to be happy must seek out and practice self-discipline and beat as hasty a retreat as possible away from self-indulgence. The best course would be for him to see to it that he never has to be restrained, but if or anyone else close to him, whether that's an individual person or a whole community, does ever need it, then he must let justice and restraint be imposed, or else forfeit happiness. You can't be happy if you don't let a community impose restraint onto your punishment, because you can't then structure this highly ordered mind, which is just, religious, and brave. All right, that's something you should take a note about. So therefore, there's an obligation in the community to provide the restraint and to allow people to have that, to develop that discipline. Okay. I'll tell you what the ideal is that we should set ourselves to live by. In my opinion, we should devote our own and our community's energies towards ensuring the presence of justice, self-discipline, and so guaranteeing happiness. That's what should guide our actions. We shouldn't refuse to restrain our desires because that condemns us to a life of endlessly trying to satisfy them. So we're saying, oh, this is really important. It wasn't mentioned here at all in the summary. We shouldn't refuse to restrain our desires. So we should be able to restrain our desires sometimes because otherwise we won't be happy because we'll always be trying to satisfy them, which that is a reference to the leaky jar argument that Socrates put forward. Take a note. And this is the life of a predatory outlaw in the sense that anyone who lives like that will never be on good terms with anyone else, any other human being, let alone a god, since he's incapable of cooperation, and cooperation is a prerequisite for friendship. In fact, Callicles, the expert's opinion is that cooperation, love, order, discipline, and justice bind heaven and earth and gods and men. That's why they call the universe an ordered whole, my friend, rather than a disorderly mess or an unruly shambles. It seems to me that for all your expertise on the field, you're overlooking the point. You've failed to notice how much power you've failed to notice how much power geometrical equality has among the gods and men. So this is kind of like a reference to mathematical equality when we look at geometry. And he's using that metaphorically to explain the order that can be created. And when you create that kind of harmonious society through discipline or self-restraint or community-imposed restraint and what was the other? The religious. What was it? The two practices. The two practices where you need to be disciplined and my brain just had a brain fart then. Oh, highly ordered. Yep, the highly ordered structure. So he's saying, once you create those things, that order is what's going to allow you to be happy. As among gods and men, one should try to be disappropriate. There you are, then. Now, either we have to prove this argument wrong by showing that happiness does not depend on a person having attributes of justice and self-discipline, and unhappiness on immorality, or we have to accept that it's true and try to see what follows from it. All those earlier conclusions follow Callicles, the ones you asked me if I was serious about when I claimed that we should denounce any wrongs committed not only by ourselves but even by our family and friends, and that this is what rhetoric should be used for. So there's the one positive of rhetoric that was mentioned in previous readings. Moreover, the point Polus conceded out of embarrassment, according to you, has turned out to be true, that doing wrong is more contemptible than suffering wrong, precisely because it's worse than suffering wrong. And it's also true that for someone to be a genuine rhetorician, he does in fact have to be a moral person to understand morality. And this in turn was the point Polus said to Gorgias. Gorgias considered out of embarrassment. Against this background, let's consider whether or not you were right to fault me for my inability to defend myself or my family or my friends or to rescue them from terrible danger. You say that I am as vulnerable as a person with no status at all to anybody's passing inclination to smash me in the face, to use your forceful expression, to confiscate my property and to send me into exile, or even, if worse comes to worse, kill me. And according to you, there is nothing more contemptible than being at the mercy of people like this. So, just paraphrasing Callicles' argument, the strong could just easily appropriate everything he has. Well, I've already stated in my view that once, but there's no harm in repeating it. I deny that being wrongly smashed in the face or stabbed or robbed by a cut purse is the most contemptible thing that can happen to a person, Callicles. I claim that it's more contemptible. So he's still saying those horrible things that happen to you are contemptible. They shouldn't happen. But it is more contemptible and worse as well to hit and cut me and my property without just cause. And I also claim that to steal, enslave, burgle, and in short do any kind of wrong against me and my property is not only worse for the wrongdoer than it is for me, the target of his wrongdoing, but is also more contemptible. As I say, these things are the conclusion we reached before in an earlier phase of the discussion. and they're securely tied down, if you'll pardon the rather extravagant expression, by arguments of iron and adamant. I have no idea what adamant is. That's how it seems to me. In any case, and unless you untie these bonds actually, it might call for someone younger and more forceful than you. Anyone whose opinion differs from the one that I'm proposing at the moment cannot fail to be wrong. All I am saying is what I always say. I myself don't know the facts of these matters, but I never met anyone, including the people here today, who could disagree with what I'm saying and still avoid making himself look ridiculous. Anyway, I suggest that the facts are as I've said. If so, the worst thing for a criminal is to commit crimes, except that if you could have a worse than worse, it would be worse for him not to be punished for the wrong that he does. Then what kind of defense would it be? Would it really be ridiculous of a person to be incapable of providing for himself? It would have to be the inability to avert what does us the most harm, wouldn't it? It has to be a person's failure to provide that kind of defense for him, his family, and his friends, which is most contemptible, hasn't it? And to defend oneself against what one does us the second most harm, the third most contemptible in this failure in respect of what one does us the third most, and so forth. And the same principle that is amount of harm, whatever. Okay, I'm just going to stop there, guys. It's just going on. So, okay. You can't have a highly ordered mind unless you engage in behaviors that pursue the good for the mind. Good is not the same thing as pleasurable. In fact, some unpleasant things can actually be good because they do they do good things for the mind. And in the process of doing these good things for the mind, you are moving towards an ideal form of goodness. And ideal forms of goodness tend to be more ordered and less chaotic states. In the process, you have to use your discipline to create that order, to stop yourself, to restrain yourself. I mean, it's kind of analogous to the fact that a highly ordered city exists because of planning and structures like that. But if you just let that city develop by itself in some kind of self-indulgent way, it would be full of slums and shanties, and it wouldn't be the ideal city. Okay? The same thing goes for the mind. Practice the behaviors that do good for the mind. They could be pleasurable, they could be unpleasurable, but you do them. And in the process, highly structure that ordered mind so then you can have those three qualities, right? There's an assumption, according to Socrates, that that you need to do what is appropriate. That appropriate behaviors are behaviors that are good for the mind, and they allow us to also interact in society, which would be good for the mind. And that appropriateness is put into two forms. You need to act in a just way, which means you behave appropriately to others, and you need to behave in a religious way, which means you behave appropriately towards the gods. And in order to make sure that you experience the good, not just the pleasurable, or to make sure that you reject the bad pleasure, you have to be brave. You have to not seek out the inappropriate things, but if you do come across them, you don't reject them, you confront them. So you need bravery. And a person who is a paradigm of goodness needs to, I'm going to say this really clearly, a person who is a paradigm of goodness needs to have cultivated those three qualities, the qualities of being just, religious, and brave. And communities then are empowered to provide restraint upon you so that you do practice the behaviors that are difficult yet good. Of course, one of those would be punishment if you've done something wrong. So communities are enablers of people to be brave, but also to be religious and to be just. And they need to encourage the development of those qualities, and that will create happiness. Now, what annoys me is that there's just an assumption just whacked straight in there. If you behave this way, you're going to be happy and successful. Now, logically, we can assume that's the case because you'll have friends, you'll have networks, and you'll do positive things. So we can understand the sociological argument for it. There's no real philosophical argument for it. But I just thought of one then. It could be that if you, in the process of doing well by others enables you to in turn do good for yourself, improve your mind, and nurture yourself because you've got other people who can help you do that, and you can do that for yourself. It's not just a pleasurable experience. It's something you're doing to actually move yourself towards an ideal form through the just and religious behaviors because you're doing right by other people who can then in turn help you. Um, and consequently, anyone who doesn't do that is going to feel the pain because they're going to alienate themselves from others, and life is just not going to be as good as it could be. So, what one should do in turn is aim to have a good life like that, and communities should aim to enable people to live like that. And the reason why it is more contemptible to do harm to others is because in the process of doing harm to others, you are harming the mind because you are rejecting yourself from, or you are alienating yourself from those practices that can help you develop that highly ordered, just, religious, and brave mind. So actually social interaction and social connection allow you to evolve a highly ordered, just, brave, and religious mind, which therefore allows your mind to move towards the good. And the goal of all your behavior and experience should be moving towards the good, not just having pleasure for pleasure's sake. And that is what the whole text is about. Just remember, I'll say it again, that the reason why you should not it's more contemptible to do harm by others is because it prevents you from doing practices that are actually good for the mind, because society enables you to engage in practices that are good for the mind, right? Whereas suffering wrong, even though it's still contemptible, it doesn't alienate you from the community and the society that could help you engage in self-restraint and creating that highly ordered, structured, healthy mind. That's it. If you get everything I just talked about, you give yourself a full 3 for those. It's really important. I gave you like a 5-minute kind of summary of like the important arguments. I would be listening to it again, just writing down notes, just making sure that you really understand the last 5 minutes of everything that I just said. And that's it. Cheers.